The night was quiet in Los Angeles, the kind of quiet that only comes after midnight when the world finally stops pretending to be busy. A private lounge, dim lights, the soft hum of distant traffic outside. Two legends sat across from each other, not as icons, not as symbols, but as men. Elvis Presley did not look like the king that night. The sharp suits, the stage confidence, the commanding presence, those things were costumes. What sat in front of Dean Martin was a tired man, 42 years old yet carrying the weight of 70. His hands trembled slightly as he held his glass, not dramatically, just enough for someone who truly knew him to notice. Dean noticed everything. They had known each other for years. Different styles, different audiences, but they understood something about fame that outsiders never could. They knew what it felt like to be applauded and yet feel alone. They knew what it meant to smile for cameras while fighting private battles. Elvis broke the silence first. His voice wasn't theatrical, it wasn't musical, it wasn't even steady. "Dean, I think I'm already dead inside." Dean didn't laugh it off. He didn't respond with humor the way he might have in public. He leaned back slowly and studied his friend's face. Elvis wasn't being dramatic. There was no performance in his eyes. There was exhaustion. "What makes you say that?" Dean asked quietly. Elvis stared into his drink. You ever stand in front of thousands of people screaming your name and feel absolutely nothing? Dean didn't answer immediately. Elvis continued. "They scream, they cry, they reach for you like you're something holy, and all I feel is empty. I sing songs that used to mean everything to me, and now it's like I'm watching someone else perform them, like I'm outside my own body." He paused, swallowing hard. "I go home and I don't feel rest, I don't feel peace, I don't even feel pain anymore, it's just quiet, inside, too quiet." Dean folded his hands together on the table. There are moments in friendship when jokes won't work, when reassurance feels fake, when truth is the only option. "Being tired isn't the same as being dead," Dean said gently. Elvis shook his head. "No, this ain't tired. Tired is when you sleep and feel better. This doesn't go away. It's like something shut off in me, like the switch that made me feel alive." He hesitated. "Sometimes I wonder if the world loves Elvis Presley so much that there's no room left for Elvis." That hit differently. Dean understood that sentence more than Elvis knew. Fame can become a mirror that replaces your reflection. After years of being told who you are, eventually you forget who you were before the spotlight. Dean leaned forward slightly. "You know what I think?" he asked. Elvis looked up, eyes rimmed with quiet despair. "I think you're not dead, I think you're buried." Elvis frowned. "Buried?" "Yeah," Dean continued calmly. "Buried under expectations, under pressure, under the machine, under the idea that you have to be the same man you were at 25 forever." Elvis exhaled slowly. "I don't know how to dig out." Dean nodded. "That's because you've been trying to dig with the wrong tools." There was no accusation in his tone, no judgment, just clarity. "You've been trying to outrun exhaustion with more work, trying to outrun emptiness with noise, trying to outrun silence with distractions. That never works." Elvis was quiet. Dean didn't preach, he didn't scold. He spoke as a man who had learned his own lessons the hard way. "You think you're dead because you can't feel joy, but numbness isn't death, it's protection. Somewhere along the way, something hurt you deeply enough that your heart said, 'That's enough, no more.'" Elvis blinked slowly. "What if it never comes back?" he whispered. Dean's voice softened. "Then you fight for it." Elvis laughed bitterly. "Fight? I've been fighting my whole life." "No," Dean said carefully. "You've been performing your whole life, that's different." That line landed heavy. For the first time that night, Elvis's eyes welled slightly. Dean continued, steady and firm. "You want to feel alive again? Stop asking the crowd to give it to you. Stop waiting for applause to wake you up. That's not life, that's adrenaline." Elvis swallowed. "So what is life then?" Dean looked at him, not as a legend, not as the king, but as a friend. "Life is choosing to be present when it's uncomfortable. Life is saying no when everyone expects you to say yes. Life is being willing to disappoint the world if it means saving yourself." Silence settled between them. Elvis stared at the table. "I don't know if I'm strong enough." Dean leaned in slightly. You are, but strength isn't loud. It's not stage lights. It's not headlines. Strength is waking up tomorrow and deciding to change one small thing. Elvis looked at him. One small thing. Yeah, you don't fix your whole life tonight. You don't resurrect yourself in one conversation. You just choose one honest step. Elvis wiped his eyes discreetly. And if I fail? Dean didn't hesitate. Then you try again. The only real death is refusing to try. That line hung in the air. Elvis stared at Dean for a long time. And in that moment something cracked, not dramatically, not loudly, but gently. A fracture in the numbness, a small flicker. For the first time that night, Elvis didn't look empty. He looked human. And Dean knew something important. This conversation wasn't about saving a legend. It was about reminding a man that he was still alive enough to fight. When they stepped out of the lounge that night, the air felt cooler than it had when they arrived. Lowe's Angels After Midnight had a strange stillness to it, as if the city itself needed a moment to breathe. The neon signs still glowed, but the noise had faded. Elvis paused near the curb before getting into his car, his shoulders slightly hunched, not from physical weakness but from the weight of something shifting inside him. Dean watched him carefully, not with suspicion, not with fear, but with the steady gaze of someone who knew that transformation rarely comes in grand declarations. It begins quietly, in the uncomfortable silence that follows truth. The ride back was subdued. Elvis did not fill the space with jokes or stories the way he usually did. Instead, he stared out the window, watching the streetlights pass one by one, each glow fading behind them like moments in his life. Fame had moved quickly. Success had come fast. Applause had been constant. Yet here he was, wrestling with something applause could not cure. Dean did not interrupt the silence. He understood that sometimes the mind must wrestle alone before the heart is ready to act. When they reached the hotel, Elvis did not immediately step out of the car. His hand rested on the door handle, but he hesitated. You ever think, he finally said without turning, that the world only loves the version of you that entertains them? His voice carried no anger, only quiet curiosity. Dean leaned back slightly and considered the question before answering. The world loves what it sees, he replied calmly, but that doesn't mean that's all there is. Elvis exhaled slowly. I don't know who I am when I'm not performing, he admitted. That's the part that scares me. Dean's response was simple but firm. Then that's the part you need to meet. That sentence lingered in the air long after Elvis stepped out of the car. Inside his hotel room, the silence felt heavier than usual. There were no fans screaming, no cameras flashing, no musicians tuning instruments. Just the hum of the air conditioner and the distant echo of traffic far below. He sat on the edge of the bed, staring at his reflection in the mirror across the room. The man looking back at him wore the face the world recognized, but behind the eyes there was uncertainty. Dean's words echoed in his mind. You're not dead, you're buried. And suddenly the metaphor felt uncomfortably accurate. He realized that somewhere along the way, he had allowed expectations to pile up around him like soil, layer after layer, until he could barely breathe under the pressure. The next morning did not bring clarity, it brought discomfort. There is something disorienting about waking up after a night of truth. The old habits still whisper. The familiar routines still call. The body remembers what it is used to, yet something inside him had shifted, and that shift would not allow him to return fully to the illusion. When the phone rang with reminders about upcoming appearances, interviews, rehearsals, he felt a tightening in his chest. For the first time in years, the schedule did not feel like an honor. It felt like a chain. He found himself pacing the room, replaying Dean's words. Life is choosing to be present when it's uncomfortable. That phrase unsettled him because he realized how much of his life had become avoidance. Avoiding stillness, avoiding vulnerability, avoiding disappointment. The stage was loud, bright, distracting. It gave him identity without requiring introspection. But in the quiet of that hotel room, there was nowhere to hide. He could not distract himself from the fact that he had lost touch with the version of himself who once sang purely because he loved music. That afternoon, he did something small but symbolic. He canceled a rehearsal, not the entire tour, not the full commitment, just one rehearsal. The manager's voice on the other end of the line carried confusion and mild irritation, but Elvis did not explain himself. He simply said he needed time. It was the first time in a long while that he had chosen himself over expectation, and though the decision seemed minor, it felt monumental. His hands trembled afterward, not from weakness, but from the unfamiliar sensation of setting a boundary. Dean received a phone call later that evening, Elvis's voice sounded different, not cheerful, not defeated, but thoughtful. "I canceled something today," Elvis said quietly. Dean smiled faintly, even though Elvis could not see it. "How did that feel?" he asked. There was a pause before Elvis answered. "Scary, but lighter." Dean nodded to himself. "That's how you know it matters." The days that followed were not dramatic. There was no sudden transformation, no miraculous return of joy. Instead, there was resistance. There were moments of doubt. Elvis found himself questioning whether he was being foolish. The industry did not slow down simply because he needed to breathe. The pressure did not disappear. In fact, it intensified. The more he pulled back, the more people leaned in, urging him to continue, reminding him of contracts, expectations, obligations. It would have been easier to surrender, to slip back into the rhythm of automatic living. But something had shifted. Dean's words had planted a seed, and seeds do not vanish overnight. They grow quietly beneath the surface. Elvis began taking small walks in the early morning before the city fully woke up. No entourage, no announcement, just him and the cool air. The simplicity of it startled him. There were no flashing lights, no demands, no applause, just footsteps on pavement. In those quiet walks, he began to remember the young boy who once sang in church, not because anyone demanded it, but because it stirred something inside him. The real battle, however, was internal. There were moments when the emptiness returned, whispering that nothing would change, that this effort was pointless. In those moments, he felt the urge to retreat into familiar comforts, to numb the discomfort rather than face it. The mask was always within reach. It was easier to be the king than to be a man uncertain of himself. Yet Dean's voice echoed, "The only real death is refusing to try." And that line refused to let him fully collapse into old patterns. One evening, Elvis stood alone in front of a piano in a quiet room. No audience, no band, no production, just wood, ivory keys, and silence. He hesitated before pressing a single note. The sound rang softly, almost fragile. He pressed another, and then another. Slowly, a melody emerged, not for a crowd, not for a record, but for himself. It was imperfect. It was unpolished, but it was honest. And for the first time in a long while, he felt something shift in his chest. Not overwhelming joy, not explosive passion, just a flicker. A reminder that he was still capable of feeling. Dean visited him days later, not as a mentor, but as a friend. They sat without ceremony, without headlines. Elvis looked different, not cured, not transformed, but present. "It's harder than I thought," Elvis admitted quietly. Dean nodded. "Of course it is. Growth always is." Elvis sighed. "I keep thinking about who I used to be, and I don't know if I can ever get him back." Dean shook his head gently. "You don't go backward, you build forward, you don't resurrect the past. You create something new." That idea lingered. Perhaps the goal was not to return to a younger version of himself, but to rediscover authenticity in the present. The mask did not have to disappear entirely. Performance was part of his gift, but it could no longer be the only identity he wore. The real challenge was integration, allowing the man and the legend to coexist without one suffocating the other. As the weeks unfolded, there were setbacks. There were days when doubt won. There were moments when the old heaviness returned with force. But there were also glimpses of life, small conversations, genuine laughter, quiet reflection. The battle was not dramatic, it was steady. And in that steadiness, something important was taking shape. Elvis was beginning to understand that feeling alive was not about constant exhilaration. It was about presence. It was about honesty. It was about choosing to face discomfort instead of escaping it. Dean observed quietly, offering guidance when needed but never control. He knew that transformation cannot be forced. It must be chosen. And Elvis, though uncertain, was beginning to choose, not perfectly, not consistently, but sincerely. The mask still existed, but it no longer defined him entirely. The man beneath it was learning to breathe again. Yet beneath this gradual awakening, there remained a tension, a question lingering at the edge of his consciousness. What if he stopped halfway? What if the fear returned stronger than the hope? What if the world demanded more than he could give? Those doubts were real, and they would not disappear overnight. The journey from numbness to life is not linear. It is filled with crossroads. And one of those crossroads was approaching. Because choosing between the mask and the man is not a decision made once. It is a decision made repeatedly, sometimes daily. And soon, Elvis would face a moment where that choice would define not just his career, but his legacy. The flicker inside him had begun. But a flicker can either grow into a flame or be extinguished by fear. The crossroads did not announce itself with thunder or spectacle. It arrived quietly, disguised as routine, wrapped in obligation, and carried by familiar voices reminding him of what was expected. The schedule resumed its rhythm, contracts resurfaced, and the machinery of fame continued its steady motion as though nothing had shifted inside him. Yet everything had shifted. The internal tremor that began that night in the lounge had not faded. It had grown stronger, more insistent, like a quiet drumbeat beneath the surface of his daily life. Elvis felt it every time he stepped onto a stage and heard the roar. He felt it when the spotlight warmed his face and the crowd screamed his name. He felt it in the silence afterward, when the applause dissolved and he stood alone with himself. The first few performances after his small changes were complicated. He did not feel empty in the same way as before, but neither did he feel fully alive. It was as though he was walking through a doorway between two identities, not fully belonging to either. On stage, he performed with the precision and charisma that had made him legendary. His voice still carried power. His presence still commanded attention. But internally, he was observing himself more than embodying himself. He was asking questions mid-performance that he had never allowed before. Who am I doing this for? What part of this is real? What part is performance? The audience saw brilliance. They saw the king. They did not see the introspection unfolding behind his eyes. Dean watched one of those performances from the wings, not with judgment but with careful attention. He recognized the subtle shift. Elvis was no longer fully consumed by the spectacle. He was thinking. He was aware. That awareness was dangerous and hopeful at the same time. Awareness can be the beginning of transformation, but it can also amplify discomfort. After the show, Elvis did not bask in the applause. He walked directly to his dressing room, removed the stage clothes slowly, and stared at himself in the mirror once more. This time his gaze held less accusation and more curiosity. There was still exhaustion in his face, but there was also reflection. He no longer saw only a mask. He saw conflict, and conflict meant something inside him was still fighting. Yet the world around him did not soften. Management meetings grew tense. Advisors expressed concern about canceled commitments and altered schedules. Subtle pressure returned not through confrontation but through persuasion. They reminded him of financial obligations, fan expectations, legacy. They spoke of responsibility. They spoke of momentum. And beneath those conversations was an unspoken message. The machine must continue. Elvis listened, and for a moment the old temptation resurfaced. It would be easier to comply, easier to stop questioning, easier to slip back into autopilot and let the current carry him forward. One evening, after a particularly intense discussion about future tour, he found himself alone again at the piano. The same instrument that had felt like a lifeline days earlier now felt heavier. He placed his fingers on the keys but hesitated. Doubt had returned with a sharper edge. What if this attempt to reclaim himself was naive? What if stepping back only created chaos? What if the cost of authenticity was too high? The questions spiraled, and for a brief moment, the flicker inside him dimmed. He picked up the phone and called Dean, not because he needed instruction, but because he needed grounding. Dean answered without surprise, as though he had anticipated the call. Elvis did not dramatize his struggle. He spoke plainly. "I don't know if I can keep pushing against all this," he admitted. "It feels like every step forward creates 3 problems." Dean listened quietly before responding. "That's because the world adjusts when you change," he said. "It's comfortable with who you were. It doesn't know what to do with who you're becoming." Elvis sighed. "And what if who I'm becoming disappoints everyone?" Dean's voice remained steady. "Better to disappoint them than abandon yourself." That line settled deep within him. Abandon yourself. He realized how often he had done exactly that, prioritizing applause over authenticity, productivity over presence, image over identity. Regret began to surface, not the loud, dramatic kind, but the quiet realization of years spent chasing something that never truly satisfied. He thought about moments he had rushed through, conversations he had shortened, experiences he had numbed because they interfered with the pace of performance. He thought about the young man who once sang with raw sincerity, and wondered when that sincerity had become secondary to spectacle. Regret is a complicated companion. It can paralyze or it can clarify. For Elvis, it began to clarify. He could not rewrite the past, but he could reinterpret it. Instead of seeing his exhaustion as proof of death, he began to see it as evidence of neglect. He had neglected himself for years, feeding the persona while starving the person. The realization did not absolve him of responsibility, but it reframed the struggle. If neglect had buried him, intentional care could uncover him. The next test arrived unexpectedly. A major televised appearance had been scheduled months in advance, one that would attract enormous attention. The pressure to deliver perfection was immense. As the date approached, Elvis felt the tension build. The old fear whispered that if he faltered even slightly, the world would judge. But another voice, quieter but firmer, reminded him that authenticity mattered more than flawless execution. He stood backstage before the broadcast, heart-pounding, and made a decision that would define the moment. Instead of performing exactly as rehearsed, he adjusted the set list slightly, including a song that had personal meaning rather than guaranteed applause. It was a small deviation, almost invisible to casual observers, but internally it was monumental. When he stepped onto that stage, the lights blinded him briefly, as they always did. The audience erupted, as they always did. But this time he did not chase their energy. He grounded himself in the music. When he sang the personal song, his voice carried a subtle vulnerability that had been absent for years. The crowd responded not with explosive noise, but with attentive silence. It was not the loudest reaction he had ever received, but it was the most genuine. And in that moment, he felt something he had nearly forgotten: connection. Not to an image, not to a title, but to the humanity in the room. Afterward, he returned to his dressing room with a quiet steadiness. There was no dramatic triumph. There was no overwhelming joy, but there was peace, a fragile, tentative peace. He realized that feeling alive did not require constant exhilaration. It required alignment. For the first time in a long time, his performance had aligned with his inner self. Dean met him later that night and studied his expression. "You look different," Dean observed. Elvis nodded slowly. "I didn't chase them tonight," he said. "I just sang." Dean smiled faintly. "That's the difference between surviving and living." Elvis understood now that the battle was not about eliminating the mask entirely. It was about refusing to let the mask suffocate the man beneath it. He could perform without disappearing. He could succeed without surrendering himself completely. Yet even as progress emerged, the weight of regret lingered. There were still years behind him that could not be undone. There were relationships strained by absence, decisions shaped by pressure, moments lost to exhaustion. He carried those memories not as chains, but as reminders. Regret, he realized, could either drown a person or teach them. It was teaching him that life is not measured by applause but by presence, teaching him that courage is not loud but persistent, teaching him that feeling alive requires vulnerability. But progress is rarely permanent without vigilance. The world does not stop testing growth. There would be more pressure, more temptation to revert, more moments when fear would attempt to extinguish the flicker. The crossroads was not a single event. It was an ongoing choice. And though Elvis had begun choosing differently, the path ahead remained uncertain. As the months unfolded, the flicker inside him grew steadier, but it was not yet a flame. He had tasted authenticity, but sustaining it required continued courage. The weight of regret had transformed into a compass rather than a burden. He understood now that the real tragedy would not be imperfection. It would be surrender. The thought of standing at the end of his life and knowing he had abandoned himself again haunted him more than failure ever could. And somewhere in the quiet spaces between performances and conversations, he began to understand what Dean had meant that first night. "You're not dead. You're buried." The difference was not semantic. It was transformative. Dead implies finality. Buried implies possibility. And possibility, no matter how fragile, was enough to fight for. The question that lingered now was not whether he could feel again. He had felt, not fully, not consistently, but enough to know life was still within reach. The question was whether he would continue choosing it when it became inconvenient, when it disrupted expectations, when it demanded sacrifice. Because resurrection is not a single act. It is a series of choices repeated until they shape a new reality. And the final test of that commitment was approaching. One that would reveal whether the flicker inside him would grow into a lasting flame or fade under pressure. The final test did not come with warning. It did not arrive as a dramatic ultimatum or a single defining moment under bright lights. Instead, it unfolded gradually, disguised as opportunity. Invitations increased. Offers grew larger. Appearances became more prestigious. The world sensed something shifting in Elvis, and paradoxically, that shift made him more desirable. There was a renewed depth in his performances, a sincerity audiences could feel even if they could not articulate it. Ironically, the more he tried to be himself, the more the world wanted more of him. Success can be as dangerous as failure when a person is rebuilding. The attention intensified, and with it came the old rhythm of expectations. The schedule grew heavier again, though not as suffocating as before. This time Elvis was aware. Awareness, however, does not eliminate temptation. It only exposes it more clearly. The offers promised legacy-defining moments, record-breaking audiences, cultural impact. They promised to solidify his place in history in ways that would outlive him. And history, when whispered into the ear of someone who has carried both glory and doubt, can be intoxicating. Dean sensed the tension before Elvis spoke about it. They met again quietly without spectacle. Elvis's posture carried less despair than it once had, but more conflict. He explained the situation honestly. The world was opening its arms wider than ever, and the pull was strong. "It feels like destiny," Elvis admitted, though his voice betrayed uncertainty. "Like I'm meant to take this on." Dean listened carefully. "Destiny doesn't require you to disappear," he replied calmly. "If it does, it isn't destiny, it's pressure." Elvis understood the warning. He had learned enough in recent months to recognize when ambition crossed into self-neglect. Yet something inside him still wrestled with the desire to prove himself. Not to the audience, not to critics, but to himself. He wanted to demonstrate that he could carry the weight without collapsing beneath it. He wanted to believe he had grown strong enough to integrate both man and legend without one destroying the other. The decision he faced was subtle but profound. Accepting the expanded commitments would mean stepping back into a relentless pace, one that left little room for the quiet practices that had been nurturing his recovery. Declining them would mean disappointing millions and possibly being misunderstood. It was not a simple choice between good and bad. It was a choice between sustainability and spectacle. The weeks leading up to his decision were marked by introspection. Elvis began spending more time in silence than ever before. He would sit alone in the early morning, sometimes without music, sometimes with just a single instrument nearby. He was no longer trying to resurrect a past version of himself. He was trying to build a future that did not require him to fracture again. The fear of repeating old mistakes loomed large. He remembered vividly what it felt like to stare into the mirror and see emptiness. He did not want to return there. One evening, as he reviewed the final contract that would seal his next major commitment, he paused. The numbers were impressive, the exposure unparalleled, the legacy undeniable, but beneath the surface he felt a tightening in his chest, not from excitement but from recognition. He recognized the early signs of overextension. He recognized the subtle voice that whispered, "You can handle it, you're stronger now." He also recognized the counter voice that asked, "At what cost?" Dean's earlier words resurfaced, "Better to disappoint them than abandon yourself." That line had once been theoretical. Now it was practical. Elvis realized that growth is not measured by how much one can endure, but by how wisely one can choose. The old version of him would have signed immediately, driven by fear of missing an opportunity. The new version hesitated, not from weakness, but from discernment. The decision he ultimately made was neither dramatic nor publicly announced as heroic. He accepted part of the commitment, but with boundaries. He negotiated rest periods. He insisted on creative control over certain performances. He built space into his schedule for personal time. It was not a rejection of his career. It was a restructuring of it. Some advisors pushed back. Some criticized the adjustments, but Elvis did not retreat. For the first time in his life, he approached success on his own terms. The months that followed were not without strain. There were days when fatigue resurfaced, when doubt whispered that perhaps he had limited himself too much. But there were also days of clarity, of grounded performances that felt less like obligation and more like expression. The flicker inside him had grown steadier. It was not an inferno. It did not blaze with constant intensity, but it endured. Dean observed, quietly proud but never possessive of the change. He understood that mentorship is not about control. It is about equipping someone to stand on their own. In private conversations, they reflected not on fame but on purpose. Elvis began exploring creative projects that had nothing to do with chart positions or record sales. He revisited gospel music. He spent time writing without the pressure of release. He reconnected with the simple joy of sound. Regret still visited him occasionally. There were still moments when he mourned years lost to imbalance. But the regret no longer paralyzed him. It humbled him. It reminded him why vigilance mattered. The greatest danger was not failure, it was complacency. The metaphor Dean had once spoken about began to evolve in Elvis's mind. You're not dead, you're buried. He realized that resurrection is not a single dramatic event. It is a daily excavation. It is the consistent removal of layers that do not belong. It is the courage to face discomfort repeatedly. And perhaps most importantly, it is the willingness to forgive oneself for past neglect. Time moved forward as it always does. The world continued to celebrate him. The stage lights still shone. But behind the spectacle was a man who had faced himself honestly. He was not perfect. He was not immune to temptation. But he was aware, and awareness changed everything. Years later, when people gathered to honor his life, they spoke of his voice, his charisma, his cultural impact. They spoke of records broken and crowds electrified. But those who knew him intimately spoke of something else. They spoke of a season when he nearly disappeared inside himself and chose instead to return. They spoke of conversations that reshaped him. They spoke of boundaries set, of authenticity reclaimed. Dean stood among them quietly, not as a savior, not as a hero, but as a friend who had once told hard truth at the right moment. As he looked at the portrait displayed at the front of the room, he did not see tragedy. He did not see a man who surrendered. He saw someone who had faced the crossroads and chosen life repeatedly, even when it was inconvenient. He saw someone who had learned to live without abandoning himself. And in that reflection, there were no tears of regret. There were tears of gratitude. Gratitude that the flicker had not been extinguished. Gratitude that the mask had not suffocated the man entirely. Gratitude that the story did not end at the moment of despair in that quiet lounge years earlier. The phrase that once haunted Elvis, crying at his own funeral, had transformed in meaning. It no longer symbolized regret for a life untried. It symbolized the emotional awareness that comes when a person recognizes how close they came to losing themselves and chooses differently. The tears, if any, were not born of surrender. They were born of understanding. Elvis had once told Dean he felt dead inside. Dean had responded not with comfort, but with clarity. That clarity did not magically solve everything. It initiated a process. A long, uneven, human process. The difference between dying and being buried became the foundation of transformation. And in the end, what defined his legacy was not perfection, nor endless applause, but the courage to fight for his own humanity when it mattered most. The world remembers legends for their performances, but the truest measure of a life is found in the moments no one sees, the quiet decisions, the internal battles, the willingness to confront one's own reflection honestly. That is where resurrection lives. That is where identity is reclaimed. And that is why the story of that night, when a man confessed he felt dead inside and a friend refused to let him accept that verdict, remains powerful. Because it reminds us that no matter how buried we feel beneath expectations, pressure, or regret, as long as there is awareness, there is possibility. As long as there is possibility, there is choice. And as long as there is choice, there is life. The legend endured, but more importantly, the man did too.